Working cleanly with epoxy can be a challenge. I know it certainly was for me in the early days, and if you aren't careful and methodical, things can quickly descend into absolute chaos. This results in your work being messy, and all that does is to create more work down the line that will be troublesome to clean up, and nobody wants that. So in this video, I'm going to share with you my top tips for clean working with epoxy so that you can save yourself some time, clean up work and stress. We are building boats here after all, and that should be fun and enjoyable and definitely not stressful. Okay, so we've probably all seen mixing epoxy before. If you haven't, here's a quick run through of it. We've got a 5:1 ratio of resin to hardener with the 105-206 West System epoxy. The pump sets that come with those are going to dispense the correct ratio of both parts. So one pump of each part gives us a correct measured ratio. So we'll measure that out and then we'll start to mix. Now, this is all about keeping clean. Number one tip for clean mixing of epoxy is to use the correct size mixing stick. We're with quite a large tub here, and you can see that if we use a small mixing stick, we're right down inside that tub. That means that I'm going to struggle to actually get much of a hold of that mixing stick, so I'm holding it right down at its far end. And it also means that as we mix and we want to sort of scrape around the outside of that tub, you know, we're inevitably going to get epoxy coming up the side of that and then up our mixing stick. Well, because my hand is essentially down inside the tub as I'm mixing here, that means that my hand is then going to start getting covered in epoxy. And especially this is the case if we're doing large amounts of it. You know, you can end up with your hand right down inside here, just trying to get a bit of leverage on that stick. And the next thing you know, your hand is covered in mixed epoxy. It starts working its way up the stick, it gets onto your gloves, and you're in the start of your failing area. We're clean working. One thing we want to do when we're mixing is make sure that we keep that epoxy down in the lower part of the stick. And if it starts to get up there and venture onto your hands, before things descend into total chaos, get clean. So a little bit of paper towel on the side is great. Tear some of that off, wipe your mixing stick off. Just have a quick reset of where you're at with things. Wipe your hands off, and then you're good to go. Even better than that is to use the correct size mixing stick. This is something that just tripped me up for years until I finally got it right, and I thought, that makes complete sense. Use a long mixing stick if you're working on big tubs like this. Your hand is way out of the way of the epoxy. The stick's right down in the tub. You can scrape all the way around the outside of that without any problem about it getting too far up the stick. Even if you work with quite a lot of epoxy in this case, it can get up the stick much further and it's still miles away from your hand. So use yourself the correct size mixing stick for the epoxy tub that you're using. I would use this kind of smaller stick. To be honest, a tub this size, mixing pot this size, this is still too small. A little paper cup, it's on the edge, to be honest. We've got a little bit sticking out the top, but I would still probably favor the wooden one if I can. Where this is really great is for little stuff like this. You've got plenty of room outside of the tub to be holding your stick, keeping things clean, keeping your epoxy in the lower end of it. So when we start to go over to thickened epoxy, once we've put in our additives, things then tend to get even more messy because the epoxy kind of stays where it is. This is when things tend to start to get even messier. It's working up the edge of the tub, it's working up your stick, and again, this is where a long mixing stick really is going to help you out with staying clean. You can keep it away from your hands and your gloves and work nice and cleanly. Of course, I would hope that everyone is doing epoxy work using gloves anyway, as this stuff really isn't good for your skin. Using gloves is a given, but how we use them is a critical thing to consider. So this is pretty typical of how I've certainly ended up a lot of times working with epoxy. You end up with it all over your hands, all over your mixing stick. It just gets kind of everywhere. And then what happens when you start trying to pick up your pieces of wood, it's slippery for a start, but you're trying to bond things in place, stick stuff together, and you end up with all your wood parts looking like this, covered in fingerprints and marks. They get forgotten about, they get left in the surface, and you end up with really messy work. The way in which we use our gloves is a really important thing here. First of all, we want to be clean when we're mixing, as I've just mentioned, but the way in which we use our gloves is also really important before we start to put parts together. If we get messy during the mixing process, like I clearly have done here, what I started doing probably just in the last couple of years or so, but I've noticed that this has made a massive difference to the cleanliness and the way in which I can work, is actually washing my gloves. Seems a little bit odd. I never really thought of that. You kind of think of washing your hands really and not washing your gloves, but washing your gloves down makes things incredibly neat and clean. Paper towel is good for this. Again, keep a roll of this on hand at all times and just wipe those gloves down to get rid of all that excess before you start picking parts up. Even better than paper towel are these things. Wonder wipes are really great for cleaning. You can have a couple of these on the go and use them to sort of wash your gloved hands before you move on. You can do this really quickly and easily, and it's going to take all of that epoxy off your gloves. Get yourself a real nice clean pair of gloves again before you start to pick up your parts. Then you've got your epoxy in your mixing pot and you can pick up your pieces of wood without covering them in dirty epoxy fingerprints. A really good thing to do, especially if you're doing a big glue up and you don't want to have to stop in the middle of it and then restart, is to double glove. These nitrile gloves that I use, they very easily double glove. So put yourself on 2 pairs of gloves and then you can pull off the outer pair. You can do just one hand if you need to. You can do 2 hands if it's all gone crazy mucky and you got stuff on both hands. But you can easily just take those off, dispose of those and carry on with neat gloves before you start picking things up. So, although gloves may seem very mundane and boring, the way in which we use them is really important, and that massively increased the quality of work that I was doing, stopped all of this kind of fingerprinty stuff going on. You've also got to consider that we're often using clamps, drills, all kinds of tools and things like that, and we don't want that stuff to be covered in epoxy because it just ruins all of our stuff. All of these kind of practices just help prevent the spread of it everywhere and getting onto all those kind of things. So look after your tools, make your workpiece clean, double glove, and always have paper towel, or if you can get them, Wonder wipes on the go, just to clean things down before you proceed any further. Applying the right amount of epoxy in the right way will make your life infinitely easier when it comes to cleanup. When bonding, we are always looking for squeeze out, where we see epoxy coming out of the joint line. This tells us that there is sufficient coverage and contact within the joint and gives us confidence in what is going on inside. This is providing, of course, that you have fully covered all of the mating faces. What we don't want to see is mountains of glue coming out in lumps and unevenly. This generates unnecessary waste of the product, it makes the cleanup process more difficult, and it creates squeeze out which is uneven and very difficult to monitor. Okay, so when it comes to applying our epoxy for flat surfaces, I cannot recommend enough the notch spreader. I use this all the time and I'll often use it for application. I'll sometimes follow up an application with a stick or a roller or something with the notch spreader. The absolute best thing about it is it's going to give you complete uniform film thickness of the epoxy across the surface, and that is really important when it comes to clean working, because it means that you're going to have an even glue line and you're going to have even squeeze out. So we've got 3 different size teeth on here. We've got small, medium and large, and then we've got a flat side as well, which is also going to help us for removing epoxy, and we can use that just to move this around the surface. And if you imagine it like a snow plow, if you angle it like that, you're going to push all the excess epoxy in the direction of the lowest face, and that's going to allow you to move this around the surface and manipulate it quite well. Now for flat surfaces, for good mating faces, I will always use the fine tooth side. That's the one that I certainly most commonly use. If you need a little bit more gap filling, you can use the other 2 notches as well. So that'd be something like if you're joining sawn timbers, or perhaps you're doing the bottom of a boat where you've maybe got a little bit of void fill that you need to do when perhaps you are cold moulding or something. And again, we want to keep things clean, so get yourself a Wonder Wipe on the go. These are perfect for cleaning off these tools. I've tried cleaning these with acetone before and it just completely melts the notch spreader. So get yourself a Wonder Wipe, you can get that tool clean, and these are going to last ages if you keep them well clean, keep the epoxy off them. So that's the fine toothed side. We'll do the medium toothed side as well, so you can see that's actually going to use up a lot more epoxy with a greater film thickness there. Okay, so you can see that what we've got there is the fine tooth application, the medium tooth, and then the heavy tooth, the large tooth. We can also use the flat side for cleaning epoxy off where we don't need it. So we'll run that along there. And if we press a piece of wood down into that line, you can see the difference in our beads of squeeze out. So we've got a larger bead there where we've got heavier glue application, we've got a medium bead in the middle there, and then we've got a fine bead down this side here. So you can see how that regulates our glue application. What we don't want to do is try and apply this with a mixing stick. We can by all means get it out of the tub and onto the surface with a mixing stick, but if you're applying epoxy like this, getting an even film coverage is a nightmare. You're going to end up with glue-starved areas where you haven't got enough. You're going to end up with areas that have got too much. And then your squeeze out is just going to be uneven and all over the place. That's going to be not so good for the job, and it's just going to create a nightmare when it comes to cleanup as well. So get yourself a notch spreader. They are perfect for getting really even glue lines. I would do this even in keel notches down the middle of a boat. Even if I apply it with a stick, I'll just run over it with a notch spreader afterwards and even that out. And it just means that when it comes to laying that part in place and getting your squeeze out, it's all nice and even. Cleanup is real easy. Okay, now a lot of the work that we need to do in boat building is gluing edges onto things. Things such as the edge of this plywood here, gluing that onto the face of this plywood here. Now getting epoxy down to that edge is something that really I struggled with for a long time, particularly being neat. What you would tend to do is kind of mix up your epoxy. You know, you sort of end up with it on your stick like this, and then you end up just trying to kind of butter this edge, something like that. And what you end up with is, as we've seen, an incredibly uneven glue application. By the time you squeeze that down into place, you've got beads all over the place, you've got starvation in some areas, and you've got way too much epoxy in others. So I'll show you a little technique for getting a really neat edge on thin faces like that when you're gluing up. We'll just get this epoxy out of the way first of all. Now, as I mentioned, these long mixing sticks are great, especially if you're using a tub of this kind of size. What you want to do to get a really neat edge is to get that spread out around the inside of your mixing tub. You don't want big lumps of it like this. So get that worked around and kind of spread a film of that around the inside of this tub. So you can see that what we've got there is a nice even spread of that around the inside of the tub. Then what we're going to do is use a clean stick, so we'll get the majority of it off the stick, and I'm going to use it just to pick up a small segment of that. So I'm going to come in and just pick up a small section. What that's going to do is put a line on my mixing stick, and then that's going to allow me to apply that really nice and evenly to my edge. So I'll pick up my timber, and then I'm going to just draw this down the edge. So as I come down with the stick, I'm going to go along this face, and then as you can see, I can load up a really nice even bead on the edge of that piece of wood. You can see that's got me really even application. Now, I've kind of done that off to one side, so I've got a sort of triangular shape because that was the angle of my stick as I drew that down, and then we've got a peak in the middle. That's actually going to be perfect when it comes to squeeze out, because as we press this board down in, we want the bulk of the epoxy in the middle, and then it's going to kind of squeeze out to the outside. If we want to get that even better, what we actually want to do is have a peak either side. So we'll also draw down the second side of the board. And we don't need a lot more epoxy on because I've already got enough on there, so I'm almost kind of reworking what's there. A little bit more where we need it. And then I'll flip that around and I'll do the same the other side. So now you can see that what I've got on that board is a little triangular peak. I've got the bulk of the epoxy down the middle, and I've got a slope to either side. So as that squeezes out, it's going to be nice and even bead all the way along the piece. And you can see roughly what we're looking at there. So I'll squeeze that down into place. So you can see how that gives us a really nice even bead along that internal corner there. Even squeeze out, we know we've got good contact within that joint because it started in the middle of the peak and it's come out to the outside. We can just take our chisel tipped mixing stick. We can come along there and just peel that nice even bead out the way. And you can see how that mixing stick kind of lifts that epoxy away from the corner. It gives us a really neat edge. Now let's take a little look at the alternative. This is what I certainly used to do myself, and what I quite commonly see people doing is just getting a big lump of that epoxy on their timber, just trying to splodge that on an edge, and then squash our joint into place. You can see the amount of squeeze out that I got there. There's some where there's no squeeze out at all, so that probably means I haven't got enough epoxy in that joint. I've potentially also got a void in there, which I really do not want. I've got way too much in some places, and then when it comes to running my chisel tipped stick along there, I'm just going to have mountains of epoxy coming out of the place. So there's a couple of tips for neat application. That notch spreader gives you really even film thickness. Use that wherever you possibly can, and use that technique for loading that epoxy up on the edge of a long mixing stick, and then you can butter an edge really nice and quickly. That is, as well as being clean, a massive time saver. It's a really quick way to load out epoxy along an edge, and I find myself doing that quite a lot with all kinds of different applications within boat building. So there's a couple of good tips for you for application. If your job suits encapsulation, then pre-coating is recommended for a number of reasons. I made a video all about epoxy coating to discuss when it should be used versus when it shouldn't be used. So if you are unsure whether this is suitable for you or not, then take a look at that video first. I'll put a link to that at the top of the screen now. One of the great benefits of pre-coating is that it gives you one of the best ways to keep your job looking super clean as you assemble parts. This is because you are working with pre-sealed wood surfaces and not porous wood grain that will absorb glue and fingerprints. We can then just wipe up that internal face and remove any of that excess epoxy from there. And that is going to leave us with an incredibly neat glue joint. Now here I've done the same process with an uncoated piece of wood, and you can see that what happens here is as we do that cleanup, we get this epoxy into the surrounding wood fibers. That's when messiness starts to happen. And there's not really a lot that we can do to lift that epoxy out of there. In this instance, I wouldn't want to use the Wonder Wipes. There's too much risk of them potentially contaminating the surrounding wood. And if we're going to do any following processes like staining, varnishing, or possibly even painting, we wouldn't really want to be cleaning that up with something like that. When we're doing it on a pre-coated sealed epoxy surface, that's fine. We can wipe clean, get a really good finish, and we're ready to go with the following process later on. When we do stuff like this, it can cause all kinds of problems down the line, especially if you're doing bright work, particularly staining the wood. You want to be staining the wood and actually get that into the wood fibers. You're going to end up with pockets along here that aren't going to accept a stain, and that's going to be quite a pain to do. So that's another reason that pre-coating is much, much better if you are able to do it. Gives you a really clean assembly and you can wipe that joint down and clear that up. As it is, that's pretty much got to stay like that. Then of course you have the cleanup process. Providing that you have followed the previous steps that I just recommended, you should have a nice, easy job to do here. Glue lines should be nice and even along their length. Fine beads of squeeze out should be seen. And these are easily cleaned up with a chisel tipped mixing stick. This is a very well thought out tool that quickly lifts epoxy away from the face and delivers you a nice little neat corner. Okay, so when it comes to cleanup, we can choose when we do that time-wise after assembly, and that's going to change a little bit based on the cure time of the epoxy. Now, my typical preference would be right away when the epoxy is still wet before it started to gel and it's still really liquid and easy to clean up. We can just grab our chisel tipped mixing stick and we can come along like you've seen. We can easily peel that epoxy out of the way. And we can get ourselves really nice, neat looking joints. We can take the final bits of excess out of the way by putting that chisel tipped mixing stick right up square against our edge. We can come along there and we're kind of cleaning this face and this face at the same time. And we can get all of that epoxy away there really nice and neatly. Now, as I mentioned, sometimes we might want to come along here and put a fillet in this internal corner, in which case we'll do that slightly differently and we'll use the radius end of that mixing stick, but we will cover that in another video. Now, doing that right away, as I said, is probably normally my preference. In the real world, that isn't always possible. This may well be completely covered in clamps, this part here, and that is very often the case with stuff that I'm doing, and it means that working in and out of those clamps actually is very difficult, and you don't end up with a nice, neat face like that. The other reason that you may not want to clean up right away is if you haven't pre-coated your faces. As you've seen, when we clean this up with a chisel tipped mixing stick, we end up spreading that epoxy out into the faces of our part. Now, if we glue up with a really nice, neat, even bead, if we let that epoxy kick a little bit more and go past its gelled state, so it's becoming a bit firmer, we can remove that bead without then spreading that epoxy into the surrounding faces. You may choose that option as a preference, for example, when you've got clamps on the surface and you can't really get in to the parts to properly clean it up. But if you let the epoxy gel, providing there's not a lot of tension in the part, you can declamp it. It's not going to fall to pieces, but it's still soft enough that you can clean that up with a chisel later on. The third option is to clean this up once the epoxy has fully cured, and that would definitely be the least preferential one, but in the real world, we forget to do things, we go off. At the end of the day, we have lunch or something and we come back and it's cured and then we need to get it sorted out. You can clean up the epoxy at that stage, but all you need to do is introduce a little bit of heat. If you apply a little bit of heat to the epoxy and just bring that temperature up slightly, you can get it to start to soften. This only needs to be around about 50 degrees, so I would typically have my heat gun set at around about 150 to 200 degrees, and that is in degrees C. You can feather that heat in and then you can use a chisel to remove the excess from the surface. So there are my 5 top tips for working neatly with epoxy. I hope you find them useful. Try implementing those into your working practice and everything should then start to run more smoothly. Nobody likes cleaning up rock hard glue or trying to sand marks out of a nice piece of wood that they've spent ages working on. Let me know in the comments below if you have any other tips for clean epoxy working that we should add to this list. And make sure that you check out some of my other West System Quick Guide videos for epoxy boat building tips. Cheers guys, I'll catch you in the next one.